Good morning, everyone. I'm listed in the program, which is devoted to women's organizations, as the coordinator of the first Women's Ordination Conference. It's not quite an accurate statement because in 1975, I chaired a group which organized a conference called Women in Future Priesthood Now, a call to action, and it was within the context of the Roman Catholic Church, of course. But that was an ad hoc conference. It was not the Women's Ordination Conference as such. The Women's Ordination Conference eventuated from that conference, and then I was associated with that for a short while. I prefer, however, this morning to talk to you about another organization to which I belong, and that is my organization, the religious congregation to which I belong, because my involvement with that question of women's ordination fits within that larger context. So I am a member of the Adrian Dominican congregation, whose ancestral home, or what we call infelicitously sometimes our mother house, is in Adrian, Michigan. And I reflect upon the confluence of religion and feminism as a member of that congregation for 57 years now, as one who has taught in secondary and higher educational institutions. I even spent a semester teaching here at Harvard in the Divinity School, and in campus ministry over the years, and as a former prioress of our congregation. And in that latter capacity, I was also elected to serve as, in a 3-year term, in the leadership group of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. And that's the organization of all the leaders of congregations of women religious, as we tend to call ourselves, in the United States. It's not all of them. There are a few who opt out of that organization, but that's a group of 800 or 900 women. And I was also, at the same time, elected to represent the United States as one of 3 delegates to the International Union of Superiors General, which met annually in Rome. So I've had a perspective on this whole area of women religious, sisters, as we might be called, or some people call us nuns, which is not totally accurate. And they're all affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church in one way or another. And some might think right away that is some kind of a blatant oxymoron, but we'll let that go for the time being. And speaking about feminism, I do not do so from any particular definition. What I've experienced in my congregation and others nationally and internationally is the phenomenon of what is often called, following Carol Christ and Judith Plaskow, woman spirit rising, or the rise of feminine consciousness. It was occurring within my congregation and others, as in women generally, but for the most part, and by that I mean probably not most of our members were reading the feminist literature of the 50s and 60s. Some did, of course, I did, and we were able to say yes, as it reinforced our own experience. I should point out that in a congregation like mine, who are educators and ran institutions that belonged to us, that we were a highly educated group. There's probably no one in our congregation who doesn't have a master's degree, unless they're new recruits. We were administrators in schools, hospitals, institutions of higher education. We had, besides doctorates, we had a lot of, besides master's degrees, we had a lot of doctor's degrees. And in running our institutions, we were interacting with all kinds of accrediting associations. In our education, we were meeting people in other secular and Catholic universities. And so we had a broad area of experience that was not particularly noticed. One area that we did not study, for the most part, was theology in the early years. That was considered to be the province of men. At the same time, we had people overseas who were observing the colonialism and imperialism of our country and the effects it was having upon people poor people in the areas where they were. And we also had people in inner cities in our own country who were seeing the effects of poverty and national policies. And all of that was kind of going on during this time that at the same time feminism was rising. Official leaders in our church have sometimes suggested that women religious and other women in our church were unduly influenced by, quote, feminists. And that's not a positive observation, by the way. It more or less suggests that the likes of us were willing dupes of misguided women. But this is not true, of course. We were women who were caught in a patriarchal system replicated in the matriarchy of our religious congregations. The church sometimes said that those of us in religious life were like junior, that's a good word, organizations that represented the church as a whole. But beneath the surface of what appeared to be a highly controlled and obedient workforce in the church, and that's how we were regarded, discontent was brewing for all of those reasons that I've already mentioned, kinds of experiences we were having. It was about to break forth, and interestingly enough, it was the official church itself that forced a kind of geyser-like explosion. For after Vatican Council II, which took place between 1962 and 1965, some directives were sent out to all the religious congregations, and they were told, first of all, that they should hold general chapters of renewal. And we were the only group within the church who were told to do that. And we were to do it within 3 years of this notification. And secondly, in preparation, we were to consult all the members of the congregation. And we were also told we could alter some parts of our constitutions and engage in experimentation for a few years or for a short period of time. And then we were to write new constitutions. In religious communities, congregations such as mine, which is a so-called pontifical organization, we then had to take those constitutions to Rome for approval. But the crucial directive was the second one, the one that affected a kind of sea change in the religious life of women in the Catholic Church, and it was consult all the members. The members had not been consulted, usually. In general chapters, now these are the legislative assemblies that occur on a regular basis in our congregations, and most of the time they dealt with things like well, at least in time past, could we wear pajamas instead of nightgowns? What time how late could we be out on a given day? How far could we travel from the mother house and things like that? So this was new. Things came to the surface that had never been dreamed of. Certainly not by those in Rome who told us to do this sort of thing. And I, who was in my 40s at the time, like so many others, was able to, for the first time, have a forum in which to express my thoughts, feelings, questions about our religious life, and an important component of which was our identity as women in the church. But before I continue, I'd like to recount some elements of my prior experience that informed my earlier life and had a bearing on how I participated in what we call renewal. I'm the daughter of a woman, mother of 8 children, who, for her oldest daughter, wanted everything of which she had been deprived. She had actually been prevented from going into high school, so only had an 8th grade education. And she went to work to make it possible for me to have all that she had ever wanted for herself. Secondly, I'm the product of a small town public coeducational school in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, if you know where that is, thank you. A lot of people don't know where that is, where teachers took particular interest in their students and promoted them in every possible way. And I certainly experienced that. And one of the things we had in our school, which was so remarkable and has so much influence on my life, was a speech program. Started in 7th grade and went through 12th. We had to do declamations, orations, extemporaneous speaking, and then I was forced into debate. At the time, I didn't realize what an influence I was going to have as time went on. Thirdly, I went to a Catholic women's college, and there came under the influence of highly educated women with doctor's degrees for the most part, who represented hitherto unknown possibilities to me. And in that environment, I learned something very important. I learned how to be friends with women. And beside the point, perhaps, but we had one priest professor of philosophy who had a constant theme. We always said, regardless of what course we took from him, we always got the same material. But one of the things that he said over and over again, don't let anyone tell you you can't learn something or do something because you are a woman. This was in the 1940s, by the way. Our teachers, we often think that sisters were educated totally in Catholic institutions. In the 1940s, I had professors who had, all women, by the way, and all members of the congregation, who had degrees from Columbia University, from the University of Michigan, from Freiburg in Switzerland, from the University of Dublin in Ireland, and any number of other places besides Catholic University, Loyola University, and some of the Catholic universities. I entered the Adrian Dominican Sisters after I completed my college degree at a time when we had a strong, self-motivated, dynamic leader, Mother Mary Gerald Berry, who, while she imposed the usual disciplines of religious life at the time, was never an absolutist. She always made the practical decision over strict adherence to law. And when she did, she rarely, if ever, consulted bishops or priests about what she wanted to do, but if she did, she often did not follow what they told her to do. And she sent out her sisters to accomplish new endeavors without telling them what to do or how to do it, and so gave them an arena of freedom to achieve what she expected, and they did. I think particularly of the 12 women that she sent to Berry College in Miami, Florida, around 1940, and they were sent there to bring a women's college into being. They had no predetermined plan to follow. They were left to their own devices, and they succeeded. Unlike some congregations of women religious I know, we were not fitted into a kind of unified mold of behavior. In recent times, someone has said, maybe if they say it of others as well, but they say it of us, if you've met one Adrian Dominican, you've met one Adrian Dominican. Yet, my entrance into religious life involved me in a kind of schizophrenia. On the one hand, I was convinced that my decision was God's will for me, and I wanted to carry out all the observances as perfectly as possible. But at the same time, interiorly, I questioned just about everything. I remember once asking the question of another woman in my group, what does this prepare us for? I was convinced it didn't prepare us for much. And our congregation had originated from a cloistered group in Regensburg, Germany, and we had some remnants of practices that they had that made no sense whatsoever. I think of the observance of Good Friday. It was a day of great penance. We'd get up in the morning at 5:30, went through a whole series of prayers and practices, and we didn't eat until 11 o'clock. And we would all sit around the table, and somebody would come with a little tray and a brush and crumb the table. We hadn't eaten a thing. There was nothing there to crumb. And I remember asking our director, what is this all about? And she became very upset with me because she didn't know. But we did it anyway. And that's just one of a number of peculiarities. But all of this and more was in my background at the close of Vatican Council II in 1965. I and so many others were reading the documents of the Council with great excitement. I read in particular, as did so many, the document on the Church in the modern world. And we were impelled out of an inward-turning kind of spirituality, if one can call it that, of recited prayers and observances to an outward movement in relationship that encompassed the world in which we lived and expanded our notion of spirituality. Many of our members were already there, but for many more, there was a spiritual awakening. And the interesting thing about this development is that the impetus came to the congregation as a whole from the Vatican in terms of what they told us to do. And as IHM Sister Margaret Brennan was known to say, we were nothing if not obedient. We did what they told us to do. So as one involved now, we didn't get those constitutions written within 3 years of 1965. I think we finally finished in 1989, so we took our time. But as one involved in writing our constitutions, I was insistent that we claim for ourselves an inner authority that derives from our identity as a charism. That's a word we like. It's like a free grace within the church, in and for the church. We were adopting for ourselves something always central to the original constitutions of the order, which were written for the men of the order. They had a unique kind of democratic process originated by the founder of the order in the 13th century that had a series of interlocking relationships of governance. And some have even suggested that it was a model that was known to those who developed the democracy of our own country. But we felt that we had kind of merged out of the contemplative and closed members of the order, the nuns of the order, and so we didn't have that same tradition. So we were claiming it for ourselves when we wrote these constitutions. Another little point, the men of the order never had to submit their constitutions for approval in Rome. They were trusted to write their own, and they didn't have to do that, but we did. We had some interesting conversations in Rome about our claim to inner authority. Actually, close reading of how the official church is organized shows that we are really not part of the hierarchical structure of the church at all. There's an important document out of Vatican Council II, the Constitution of the Church, that says the church consists of bishops, clergy, and laity. Well, we're not bishops, we're not clergy, so maybe we're laity. Then there's a chapter on the laity that says the laity are all those in the church who are neither clerics nor members of religious institutes. So I always maintained we were aced out of the church, and that is the hierarchical church, and that's not a bad place to be. Just a little thing that happened. When we were sitting around a table in Rome with our constitutions, and we have this review board in this group called the Congregation for Religious, one of the men sitting there, he was an Irish Carmelite, as I recall, and he said, I noticed that you use the word woman a lot in this document. And I said, well, I didn't think we overly used the word woman. And he said, well, you don't want to use something that's just a fad. And that's what you're dealing with. I mean, enough said. And you know, you could get angry, get mad, but it's so ridiculous that it's just better ignored, probably. Spirituality was not a term that many of us used in former days. I've always maintained that we were schooled in an ethic, not in a spirituality. The observances of religious life were understood as to what we had to do in order to save our souls. And it often seemed to me that we were evaluated in terms of how we carried out what I would call the incidentals of our life and community, especially how we carried out our part in the housekeeping in the convent. While I and so many others yearned for more personal time for reflection and contemplation, the demands of our ministries were often totally time-consuming. And of course, we were an order of Dominicans whose motto was to contemplate and to give to others the fruits of contemplation. I was educated to the doctoral level in philosophy in the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. I'm not sure just when I began to see that the dualisms in this train of thought no longer served. But in teaching theology at Berry College in the 1960s, I often had students ask questions that I blithely answered, you know, whether they were good answers or not, probably weren't. And I remember once presenting the difference between the natural virtues and the supernatural virtues. And that's a dualism, of course. And a student said, how do I know whether I'm acting from a natural virtue or a supernatural virtue? And I'm sure that I muddled through some kind of an answer, but I knew when I tried, because, you know, you really had to have the answers, I knew it didn't make any sense, and I'm sure she knew it didn't make any sense. And I was beginning to realize that these answers were totally inaccurate and probably meaningless. And during that time, I had the experience of several of those flashes of insight that occur sometimes that instantaneously change direction. I remember going to a summer conference, and there was a priest professor there who was an expert on this kind of philosophy, and he was talking about the natural and supernatural virtues. He had a scientific background, and he had a whole, on the backboard, he had a whole electrical circuit in which he was organizing the natural and supernatural virtues and showing how they related to one another. And when he finished, I heard a woman near me let out a great sigh of appreciation. And I'm thinking all the time, well, I was just trying to deal with this, and I'm not sure this makes any sense. But at the same time she did that, a young priest in the back of the room shouted out at him, and he said, and when you know all of that, what more do you know about yourself? And I immediately resonated with that question. And it just said, yes, there's something wrong here. It was a moment of change for me. This same priest, by the way, I remember we were walking around the grounds. We were up in North Carolina in the mountains for this beautiful area, and he had a clipping. And he held it out to me, and he said, what do you think about this? And I looked at it, and it was a picture of sisters with placards demonstrating outside a dormitory at Loyola University. Some here may remember this. I think they were the BVM sisters. I'm not really sure. Fully habited with these placards. And I looked at it and I said, well, that doesn't seem to be that appropriate thing for sisters to be doing. And of course, I'm wearing the full habit of the Dominican order at the time. And he pointed at me, he said, if you have the right to wear that, you have the obligation to put it where the gospel is being contradicted. And that was another complete yes, you know, absolutely. It became quite clear to me that women were caught on the negative side of all these dualisms. So we shared that position with minorities, the poor, the marginated, and the earth. My involvement with the conference Women in Future Priesthood Now, a call to action in 1975, did not stem from any desire on my part to be ordained a priest. I saw the issue as subsuming all the issues on women that prevailed in my church. And Ada Marie, I think, yesterday reflected on what that meant to her. And somewhere in this letter, he said, the church owes women a debt of gratitude. And that just stuck in my head. And so we had the conference, and then after the conference, the bishops, some bishops decided they really ought to pay attention to these people. And so for a while, I thought I was caught in the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I got a call from Maria Riley. Some of you may know of her. She's very prominent and out of the Center of Concern in Washington, does a lot of work on women's issues globally. But at that time, she was on a committee in Washington. She called me in the morning and she said, you're going to get a phone call today. I said, oh, okay. And she said that she had been called by Father Kelly, who's now the Archbishop of Louisville, but he was a priest then in the bishops' conference. He called her to call me to tell me that I was going to get a phone call. Okay, then the next day he called and he told me that I was to call Bishop Malone of, not Columbus, Columbus I think, because there was a committee of the bishops that met with sort of non-official groups. And I was to call Bishop Malone and ask to meet with his committee. I'm out of time. I'll finish this part. So then I did. In other words, they weren't going to call us, but we had to call them. And so we met at the airport, and we had a meeting, most of us from the organizing committee, with these men, and talked about this conference. And I remember at the time saying, one thing bothers me, and that's that sentence that I got from Bishop so-and-so that said, the church owes women a debt of gratitude. I said, the church doesn't owe me a debt of gratitude. I think I'm in the church. And Bishop May was very sympathetic to this whole thing. Said, oh, sister, you know, they talk like that all the time. The church owes the Knights of Columbus a debt of gratitude. The church owes the Holy Name Society a gratitude. I said, I never heard anybody ever say the church owes men, meaning males, a debt of gratitude. And these forms simply say the church is male, you're sort of an adjunct of some kind, not totally in the church. One of the bishops there became so upset with this whole conversation, he left. He said he had a plane to catch, but I don't know, maybe we were at the airport. Fast getaway. But within the year, he called me and asked me to come and talk to the priests of his diocese on this whole question. Let me just, I have a couple more things here, but I'll bring this to an end. If you have any questions about some of this sort of thing, you can ask them. But I would like to say that I began to write some things, and early on I wrote a paper called The Spirituality of Women, a New Immanence, and that was kind of breaking down again this transcendence, immanence kind of a duality that we have. And of course our problem is that so many of our thought processes and our language come out of a dualistic strain that almost prevents ourselves at times to really express what we mean, because we're using dualistic language that has a background trying to say something different with it. But we're getting beyond that, I think, to some degree. But I'm going to say in the end that the religious congregation of women is, as I said earlier on, a tremendous support to me. People here have talked a lot about community. We have community. We are not in the hierarchical structure of the church. We have, as yet, not fully realized just who we are in the church and what we can be in the church. We go a long way and we get into trouble from officialdom very often. But nonetheless, I think that one of the great challenges that we have within the whole strain of feminism in the church, who women are in the church, is to fully realize who we are, put it into practice, and achieve what we can. And I think we can do a great deal. I'll read you finally just the vision statement that comes from our chapter enactments. We have vision statements on the poor, on women, on the environment, on racism, and we try to address these things. It says, we stand in communion with women of the world, compelled to confront violence and oppressive systems. We break our silence of complicity. We claim our freedom to liberate the creative woman's spirit. We call for the full release of women's energies to bring about balance and harmony with all creation. Thank you.